last few weeks of Edward Flood's life, we also watch as Justin and Faraday try to outwit and outsmart Spencer and Lisa as they are tortured and their lives are on the line. So when it comes to characters introduced this episode, we have Edward and Valentina. Edward is Edie and Hatch's father, Clive's grandfather, who was the CEO of Origin, amongst another company before the government got involved, the CIA that is, and they put him in place. Now, as for how people see him, it varies depending on who you're talking to. Hatch has never really liked his father, and Edward had a lot of moments of butting heads with him. Yet, at the same time, because Edward was a bit of a misogynist, he put his son on a higher pedestal than he did Edie. Someone who, potentially because she was a woman, he was very critical of her to the point that, as Hatch has spoken about before, he pretty much gave her an eating disorder. But as for how Edie sees her father, that evolves from her admitting some of his faults but still trying to put him as this, not hero, but at least someone that she and his son could look up to now really starting to admit that her dad was just a bastard. As for Valentina, Valentina is Spencer's mom, who was a Russian immigrant who we know formally before this episode as being a terrorist. However, we learned a bit more details when it comes to who Valentina was and whether or not, when it comes to Ivan, aka Spencer, whether she abandoned him or not. So let's start the recap. To begin, we have to go into the fact that there's the facts as we've known them and the facts of what actually happened. With Clive learning that Hatch is no longer part of Origin, it makes him question a few things. After all, he is part of the company, yet he's often not part of the conversations, so he confronts his mother about this. And being that Edie has always had issues with the men in her family undermining her, underestimating her, and just challenging her, she doesn't take well to her son doing the same. Hatch has always been someone who she had to compete against even though he didn't show much effort. When it comes to Edward, he always downplayed who Edie could be in terms of long game thinking, and because of that, he wasn't even going to give her a controlling interest in Origin. Instead, he was going to give it to Hatch, even though, from what we've seen in this episode and also seen in the past, Edward has barely ever said positive things about Hatch. Yet, seemingly because he was a man and apparently may have long game thought processes, that was going to be the heir. So, with that in mind, Edie, when she was walking with her father, and he revealed this information to her, she pushed him, and rather than Edward committing suicide as we've been told previously, she actually murdered him. And the only person who's a witness to this is Clive, but being that Clive was 10 years younger than he is now, he was just a kid, and so his mom killing somebody was a little bit too traumatic for him to process, and so he, until now, has kept this her secret. But now he has told Hatch this, and so comes the question, when it comes to the will and everything, how did Edie fix that so that she would become CEO and Hatch would maybe have some interest in the company, but not the kind that Edward intended? For the second topic, let's start off with how Faraday and Spencer are butting heads in Spencer's attempt to torture and get information out of Faraday. One of the initial issues for Spencer is that Faraday, in terms of, pulling out his teeth, trying to waterboard him, things like that, the traditional methods are not working when it comes to torture. So with that, Spencer gets increasingly frustrated, and when it comes to Faraday, he's not necessarily trying to give Spencer a hard time, it's just he doesn't really know anything. But as Spencer's reminded that x-rays and stuff like that mess with people like Faraday, so come Spencer really starting to make some notable moves, and that's when Watt pops up. As we saw before, Watt is there so that not only Faraday can tap into his adept, but also so that he can survive and potentially progress in a way that Thomas needs him to do. So with that, Faraday starts to reveal things like Thomas Newton trying to bring amphibians to Earth, that the core is going to be used for a ship because amphibians over in Amphia, they don't have the type of power needed to just come over here just because a signal got sent out saying that you should come. Thomas needs that core. He needs quantum fusion in order for things to work. But that's not enough. Spencer wants to know where they're gonna go, where's Thomas Newton, and all these types of questions which Faraday doesn't have the answer to. And then when it comes to Justin's part in this, she's going back and forth with Lisa because with them destroying that lab, so does all that research go away. So Lisa's trying to figure out, hey, give me something so I can help you, because after a certain point, Justin, with her pretty much telling Lisa to go to hell, if not trying to get into her head, she becomes just another pawn in this game against Faraday. And granted, it works, but after a certain point, Faraday stops being a drone and he taps into that adept, and he decides, as Justin was playing with Lisa's head, Faraday decides he's going to go into Spencer's head. This leads us to the third topic, which is just this big reveal that happens. So, Faraday is being tortured by Spencer. Justin, she's not really giving up a damn thing, and she's getting used as a pawn to kind of make Faraday do something, because the X-rays are essentially killing Faraday, and only thing he really has to lose is Justin, because he's an alien. He doesn't have any monetary things physically. His skin suit, you can rip it apart, you can take out molars and stuff like that. It's kind of whatever to him. In waterboarding, he has 4 stomachs, so that does nothing. So X-rays and Justin, but if you kill Justin, you lose the research. If you kill Faraday, you lose a major connection to Thomas. So Spencer's in this very weird place because he has more to lose than he has to gain. And once you add in the fact that he just wiped out an abbey full of nuns, it's not looking good for him, and it's also not looking good for Lisa. So, with all this in mind, Faraday takes control of the situation by playing a game of Russian roulette and tapping into Spencer's need to have a high-risk, high-reward type of situation. So, what is the thing that he's dangling in front of Spencer in order to take control of the situation? Valentina. He brings up how he knows the truth about Valentina, and he breaks it down with the goal being that maybe Spencer may shoot himself in the head. So, the thing is, Spencer has 5 questions. Each time he has to pull the trigger. And throughout those 5 questions, what we learn, or at least what Faraday pushes and Spencer accepts his logic, is that Valentina was not as bad as he was led to believe. That if anything, she was a pawn in Drew's game, a long game, as we've heard the term when it comes to Edward and what he wanted to do. And what she essentially wanted to do was make Spencer into an asset. One that, as we've seen, will become the type who likes to hunt white whales and maybe, in a way, allow her to have some degrees of separation from anything unethical. Because with that in mind, you also have to factor in that we learned that when it comes to Thomas Newton being tortured, Drew was in the room. So this is a bit her white whale, this whole Thomas Newton thing. Because lest we forget, she is the one that introduced the whole idea to Spencer. And as Faraday goes on, and Spencer just nods and is like, that makes logical sense in terms of his mother, in terms of Drew grooming him and setting him up and everything. After some point, Spencer got everything he thinks he can get out of Faraday, and he's ready to kill him. But then Lisa does 2 things. One, she shoots Spencer right through the cheek, which is supposed to be a very shocking moment, but as we said in the past video review, Lisa, between her phone calls and also her always seeming like she could betray Spencer for her own career, you can kind of see that was coming. And she doesn't just shoot him in the cheek, take Faraday and Justin leave, she kills him. Which leads to the question of, okay, are we going to meet who she's looking for? And the answer is yes. She's looking for Henning, who has decided to, alongside Pressman Fawn, take a vested interest in Faraday and also in Justin. And alongside protect them, they're also protecting Portia, Josiah, who's actually alive, and of course Molly. And This comes at a good time because Drew is back on the scene despite how it seemed like she got downgraded, and she has already made a deal with Edie, who pretty much, for her part of the deal, what she gets out of it, she just wants to be credited with quantum fusion being created. Which shows when it comes to Farrah and Justin, she doesn't care about them, what research they did, what they have to sacrifice. She wants that recognition so that she can continue to prop herself up into this person that her dad should have been proud of, rather than continuing to invest in Hatch and hope that he would turn the corner. But getting back to Justin and Faraday, Henning and Lisa bring them to some weird jungle-like area, and this is when it starts to all click together. And when things all connect, you realize that Pressman Fawn is actually Thomas Newton, and that he is the old Baron that people have been talking about. And as you saw in the movie, he uses Henning in order to be kind of like his representative, rather than, step onto the scene, since at this point his cover's long been blown and he can't really safely put himself out there as he advocates Faraday to do. First highlight for us is just Edie's backstory being developed. For at this point, I would say before this episode, Edie seemed like one of the weakest links of this show. She wasn't someone who was necessarily all that interesting because we didn't get to explore her relationship with her father, we didn't get to really see much of her relationship with her son, or even fill in the blanks about who is Clive's father and how that came to be. So with that in mind, it's kind of like, what are you going to do with this woman? Because Hatch's storyline seems to be wrapping up with him selling his part in the company, and Edie, y'all haven't really done much to make her interesting. But as we've seen multiple times of watching The Man Who Fell to Earth, this is not a Instapot type of show. You can't just think like you throw something in the microwave, it's going to stop popping and you're going to be amazed and smell it and all your senses tingled. As this episode notes, a lot of things operate on long game. And when it comes to Edie, her storyline operated on the long game. She was supposed to be someone you never really took note of or suspected much of. Perhaps similar like Edward in a way. But now, between learning that she killed her father, that she's more than capable of killing her favorite horse, maybe even willing to kill her son, and who knows, maybe her brother, in order to get the sense that she is everything that her father said she wasn't, she's now someone you have to take note of, because she likes to push boundaries in a way to make it very much clear that if you underestimate her, if you undermine her, or you undervalue her, she will take advantage of that and not just kill you, but show you all that she can be as she walks over your corpse and moves forward. The second highlight is how Justin and Faraday handled Spencer and Lisa, and that's just because when it comes to Faraday, I think the main thing we got out of that is just an understanding of how much he has evolved since we first met him. Him being able to emotionally manipulate Spencer really shows his growth in terms of going from completely obtuse to the point that Justin can think he's autistic, to him going to kind of like picking up on things and like trying to follow habits to understand human nature, to him really embracing the idea of being an adept and tapping into how much parts of him are just like Spencer, and knowing how to pick that apart in order to not just buy time, but potentially get the type of solution that he wanted. Now, granted, he didn't get Spencer to kill himself with the Russian roulette game, but he did buy time for Lisa to eventually find her moment to take Spencer out. And with bringing up Lisa, you have to also take note of Justin, who also was able to manipulate Lisa, but without all the information that Faraday collected. For when it comes to Faraday, he had time to go through computers, go through the TVs, and learn everything he could about Spencer, including that his real name is Ivan, learn about his mother, and theorize how much Drew probably took a part in deconstructing Ivan's family in order to make him an asset. Justin didn't have all that. She didn't have all this information on Lisa. The two barely interacted with each other or spoke. Yet she was still able to say and know enough in order to get into Lisa's head, and I would even say to add in, on a non-Lisa note, that badass moment when she spit out, I forgot what type of liquid it was, but she had that man's whole face and front end catch on fire. I would say just as much as Edie kind of proved that she shouldn't be underestimated, especially when it comes to what violence she's capable of, Justin did the same thing in this episode. The next highlight's going to be Lisa's betrayal of Spencer, and the main reason this is a highlight for us because, yeah, we already knew it was going to happen, so in a way it kind of felt anticlimactic, but at the same time, there's still. It's that switch that's kind of interesting to us. Lisa has been portrayed as a potential villain thus far, someone who, to make a name for herself, would probably betray Spencer, if not join him all the way to the end in order to boost her career and move on to something better. But now, with things being flipped, she has to be seen as a hero, or at least somebody who could be on Faraday and Justin's side. And with that comes the question of what led to all this. Now, again, we only have one episode left for this season, so who knows how much they're going to pack into that, unless they make it more than an hour long. But I think at this point, the show has shown us that we're not going to get everything as soon as we want it. Sometimes we're going to wait longer than we should have to, but eventually it's going to catch up to where it needs to after it finishes, making sure like Faraday's situation is set up, Justin is, Spencer's made into this, maybe you can see him as a sympathetic figure considering what happened to him with his mother and how Drew molded him, but everything comes in due time. And I think with Lisa, there's the hope that the same will happen to her in terms of really boosting her up now that she had this major shift in her character arc. The last highlight is Drew's long game. Like Edie, you can see that when it comes to Drew, she got sick and tired of being undervalued, underestimated, and ultimately undermined. And I think once we got Faraday's perception of what she's done in order to get to this point, when you think of her story mixed in with Edie's, it's not perfect, but it's so good. So good. But when you really think about it, both of these women, even though you could easily see them as villains because they're going against our heroes, they did what they had to, because if they allowed themselves to keep dealing with this glass ceiling that clearly nobody was going to remove for them, where would they have been? Drew might have still been some type of analyst without this field work that she's getting to do. And Edie would have still been second to her brother, even though her brother doesn't take this seriously. But rather than do that, Edie killed her father and rose up in the ranks. And I would say when it comes to Drew, she got very calculated. Drew decided to build a kind of network which would allow her to take Spencer under her wing, and even when he messed up in royally big ways, she was still able to save him. Also, when he decided to backstab her, she was able to rise right back to where she was, maybe even farther, by showing you just gave the reins to a crazy man, now give him to me. And with that, she has now all the force that she needs so that she can truly prove herself and solidify her role beyond this network which has allowed her to do so many things. Now, instead of having to get a co-signer, she gets to be the person. She gets to be the man, for lack of a better way of putting it. Just as much as Edie, with taking out her father, with eliminating her brother from the company, and wanting to have quantum fusion being under her name, she gets to have that validator. She doesn't need a co-sign of some man. She gets to be the man. And I would even say up till now, you could kind of see Lisa was also on that path. Lisa was taking advantage of what Spencer could have to the point where she was trying to compensate for what he lacked, hence her wanting to become partners with him. And you could even assume that there came a point where she could have really taken over this whole situation, and for a second when she shot Spencer, you could have saw that. But now, just as much as Drew has a long game, Edie has a long game, Lisa's part of a long game for Thomas Newton, and it's not clear whether or not, again, if she's going to be someone that's just strictly loyal to somebody else or focused mostly on being loyal to her own self. But needless to say, this show has definitely proved itself to be something that is not episodic, where you could just take one episode at a time and you can fully judge it by that. You have to think in terms of a huge arc over the entire season in order to really appreciate what this show's trying to do with each and every character. So overall, when it comes to this episode, I feel like it definitely gives you the type of penultimate episodes we don't get consistently throughout media. It sets up a grand finale which could potentially blow viewers' minds, and while a lot of times when it comes to penultimate episodes, sometimes it kind of like falls off the cliff when it comes to the last episode of the season, a part of me realizes with me underestimating, undervaluing, and a bit undermining the man who felt it up so far, I'm at the point where I should just, instead of keeping my expectations low and hope it, surprises me, maybe it's time to bring up the expectations and just let this show remind you how brilliant it can be and then just enjoy it.